We decided to conduct an internal review of our polling methodologies for our political polling, which will be submitted to the British Polling Council. And this covers both our traditional voting intention polls and MRP, which I will run through. But this review has been taking place over the course of 2025 so far, and I'm pleased to say that we now have a methodology which we are very happy with. And this isn't to say that we didn't do well at the last general election. In fact, we did rather well. But as a company, we are constantly striving to improve the accuracy of our polling and iron out any issues that we could see in the industry and in our own polling specifically. But I'm going to go through first a few of the things that went well at the last election for us, and separately where we thought we could improve, and then what we have done to address those potential problems. So our final voting intention poll was published about 2 to 3 weeks. Sorry, I should say our final traditional voting intention poll was published about 2 to 3 weeks before the general election. We don't think that's the best way to assess our accuracy, given the changes that occurred over the course of the election campaign. So for the purposes of this review, we are releasing some unseen internal data, which we collected over the final week of the election campaign. And much of this went into our final public MRP release. So using our methodology as it existed last year would have produced a result of 40% for Labour, 24% for the Conservatives. Compared to the rest of the industry's final polls, this would have ranked us 7th out of 20 in terms of accuracy. So we're kind of in the upper tier of pollsters there. So on the whole, we can be pretty pleased with that result. Going into kind of what we did well, we think there were 2 real standout methodological choices which we thought were particularly good. The first was a turnout model. So generally speaking, people are not very good predictors of their own behavior, and in addition to that, there is very much what's known as a social desirability bias to voting in elections. So people will generally, to the interviewer or whatever, to the online panel, they will typically overstate their likelihood of casting a ballot at the election, which makes it difficult to assess, who is actually going to vote. So to combat this and kind of strip out the personal opinion behind this, we decided to use validated voter data from the British election study. So really helpfully, the British election study, after every election, does a face-to-face panel of voters, which they then cross-reference against local electoral registers to determine whether people actually voted. And as far as I'm aware, this is the only study like this of its kind in the UK. So using this data, we could then create a model based on various demographic factors to determine the likelihood of them actually casting a ballot at an election, rather than just whether they say they're going to vote or not. So like demographics we could include in this is things like whether they voted last time, how interested they are in politics, what their attitudes to voting are, or various other demographic factors that might go into it, like age, gender. Those age and gender aren't actually included in our model, but just some examples there. So the turnout model, as you can see here, took about 2 points off Labour's margin compared to just weighting based on demographics alone. So it had quite a significant impact. We're confident in hindsight. Well, we were confident at the time, but we were also confident in hindsight that this was the right approach. And I think it's kind of good to see this kind of modeling become more common across the industry. So secondly, we used what's known as a squeeze question in the industry to further interrogate the views of people who said they were undecided. So our research before the election showed that about 60% of the time, undecided voters would accurately reveal their eventual voting decisions if you asked them a second time who they would vote for if they were forced to make a choice. So in this instance, we wanted to still allow people to select I would not vote if they genuinely weren't going to vote. But for our squeeze question, we removed don't know as an option, so they were either forced to choose a party or forced to choose would not vote. We found in our research that this method was just as effective as other more complicated methods of handling undecided voters while carrying much less risk. So that's the methodology we settled on for dealing with undecideds. So you can see overall that these two approaches took Labour's lead from about 19 points here, you can see on demographics only, to 16 points. So yeah, it took 3 points off Labour's result and ended up significantly closer to the election result. But so to improve things, we came up with a very long list of potential sources of error, which required a lot of analysis. But after completing that analysis, we now have 3 which we think explain most of the gap between our polling results and the election result. So turning now to potential sources of error, we had a very long list of these, which we have tested. And after lots of analysis, we have now ended up with 3, which we think explain most of the gap between our polling results and the election result. The first is past vote weighting. So basically, we were concerned that people might misremember how they voted at the last election, 2019, given the high level of vote switching that we see in British politics at the moment. In hindsight, we think that not weighting by past vote as a result of that was probably a mistake. Having past vote weightings would have improved our results, particularly around Labour and the Liberal Democrats. The second issue is, I think, a larger one and part of a wider issue for the industry, and that is around political engagement, particularly around getting enough respondents who aren't very interested in politics to answer surveys. Naturally, if you're less interested in the topic that a survey is trying to measure, you're less likely to answer it. However, the industry is now facing a growing problem of political engagement being increasingly correlated with voting intention. So we've got kind of like 2 examples from 2024. We had in the UK very high interest respondents being much more likely to support Labour, who were overestimated by every single pollster. In the US, people who had low levels of interest in politics were much more likely to support Donald Trump, who has been underestimated in the polls for 3 elections in a row. So we can kind of start to see there the relationship between polling misses and political interest. So to mitigate this, we are now going to be weighting by political interest levels using targets from the British election study. Now, unfortunately, obviously the census doesn't ask people how interested are you in politics, so we've had to come up with ways to generate estimates for the whole population. Now, we could just use the population from the British election study, but that itself could come with issues. So what we've done is account for the fact that even people who answer the British election study are still more likely to be interested in politics than those who don't answer, despite the British election study having very high response rates. So we've come up with a non-response bias adjustment method, which was inspired by a very good book, which I'd recommend, called Polling at a Crossroads by Michael A. Bailey. So that came out last year. Using this methodology, we have generated estimates for the whole population, again, taking into account the fact that those who are more likely to be politically engaged are more likely to even respond to the British election study than those who aren't. So we've got our population who answer the British election study, and then we've got our population who don't, and we've used a clever methodology to estimate the levels of political interest for the entire population. So using past vote weights and political interest weights decreases error even further and improves the vote share for every single party. So you can see here Labour's down to 38, Conservatives exactly correct on 24, Reform exactly correct on 15, Lib Dems exactly correct on 12, the Greens on 6, and others on 6. So that gets us most of the way there. And I can confirm now that this is our new methodology. You can see why in a second. This methodology would have seen us as the second most accurate pollster of the 20, which would have been a brilliant result for us. Obviously, yes, there is still a small gap between the new methodology and the election result, but we think we've also identified how this has come about, and that is through late swing. Now, I just want to give a quick caveat, because late swing is very much the kind of get out of jail free card for pollsters when there's a polling miss, but in this case, it's probably correct. We know that Labour's vote share fell over the course of the election campaign, and there is now evidence that people did vote differently to how they said they would, even in the last week of the election campaign. Very helpfully, YouGov's analysis has showed that Labour's vote share was significantly lower in post-election vote recall, even among the same respondents who said that they were going to vote Labour before the election was. So very helpfully, YouGov's analysis showed that Labour's vote share was significantly lower in post-election vote recall, even among the same respondents who said that they were going to vote Labour before election day. Applying YouGov's differences in recall and pre-election voting intention to our final poll using our new methodology gets us very, very close to the final result, with every party within 1 percentage point of their election vote share. I think given the sampling error inherent to the medium of polling, this is more or less as accurate as you could expect a poll to be without a huge amount of luck. And we are therefore confident that this new methodology solves most of our issues from 2024. And I'm pleased to say that these changes have now been implemented. And our new voting intention poll, which came out this week, has been conducted using this new methodology.